You know, Wikileaks just actually came out.
These cyber attacks come from the highest levels of the Kremlin.
Russia's attempt to expose Democratic Party emails and sabotage Hillary Clinton's campaign.
You have to be a sociopath to think that we ought to just take all of this material and dump it all on the internet.
It's been called a form of torture by the UN, but it's still used regularly.
Every time people look at segregation, they are horrified in this country. They should continue to be horrified.
I'm Diana Swain. We're the investigators. This is what we do. We're pulling back the curtain on the work that we do as investigative journalists, bringing you the stories behind the headlines. And this week, all around the world, journalists have been grappling with how to handle a deluge of emails dumped online, with only about 2 weeks to go before voting day in the U.S.
You know, Wikileaks just actually came out. John Podesta said some horrible things about you, and boy, was he right.
Donald Trump taking aim at his Democratic rival for president, Hillary Clinton.
She wants open borders. People are going to pour into our country.
And getting his information from leaked emails taken from the private email account of Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. A massive pile of documents published by the whistleblower website Wikileaks, calling into question Clinton's credibility.
Donald Trump has accused her of wanting open borders. She's never said that. Now we have the evidence that she has said that.
It's not the first time Wikileaks has grabbed headlines during this U.S. election campaign.
The leaked DNC email suggesting Senator Bernie Sanders may have been right when he said it was rigged against him.
The leaks becoming an important source for journalists who've had to sift through hundreds of thousands of WikiLeaks documents while grappling with tough legal and ethical questions. Questions that Glenn Greenwald had to ask himself when he was approached by U.S. intelligence contractor Edward Snowden in 2013.
NSA and the intelligence community in general is focused on getting intelligence wherever it can. The NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. Any analyst at any time can target anyone.
The proof? A treasure trove of documents given to Greenwald that would capture the attention of the world. Glenn, these latest emails, just like the NSA documents you had, were stolen. How much does that matter from an ethical standpoint?
I don't think it matters at all. As a journalist, I think the only question that you ask yourself once you've determined that the material is authentic is what is it in the public interest to know, and then you go about and report it. Many of the most important stories in the history of modern journalism have come from sources who have taken information without authorization. And as a journalist, you're not a priest, you're not morally judging your sources. Your duty is to inform the public about what they ought to know, and that's the really only question that needs to be asked.
To this day, you haven't published everything that was in that NSA trove. How have you decided what to use and what to hold back?
Well, when Edward Snowden came to us and provided us with that archive, he very clearly had certain parameters in mind about what should and shouldn't be published. And in particular, he was concerned that we not harm innocent people, either their reputations or their privacy or putting them in danger. And so we've spent years now, 3 years, very carefully curating the material to make sure that we publish everything that the public should know so they can have an informed debate about what's being done to their privacy, while at the same time protecting the privacy and reputational interest of innocent people.
So that's your approach. Of course, you're also co-founder of the website The Intercept. That approach is different than what WikiLeaks has done, where it puts everything out there. Why have you taken a different approach?
Well, because I think that as not just as a journalist, but as a human being, I have the ethical responsibility to avoid actions that can harm innocent people. And if you look at some of the things that WikiLeaks has published, even in this latest batch of material from John Podesta's emails, there are things in there talking about the mental health problems of individuals who have no power in Washington, people whose private lives have been exposed for no reason whatsoever. I think WikiLeaks might regard them as collateral damage or something. But I view my role differently.
And what's wrong with putting everything out at once?
It's not a difficult call. You have to be a sociopath to think that we ought to just take all of this material and dump it all on the internet without regard to the impact that it will have for innocent people. Who goes around thinking that journalists or anybody else should take actions completely indifferent to the effect that it has on other human beings? That's certainly not something that I find persuasive.
These data dumps are becoming more frequent. You can name so many in the past year, including Panama Papers, and they really run the spectrum all the way to Colin Powell's personal emails. He's not in office anymore. How much should we care about what he wrote in there? Do we care what he thinks of Bill Clinton? Are those things relevant? Do they really speak to the public interest?
I don't think the line can be drawn that clearly. Colin Powell is somebody who has a great deal of information about what the highest echelons of the government of the United States is doing, and that government continues to be the most powerful nation, the most powerful government in the world. Colin Powell speaks regularly to high-ranking U.S. officials. He knows a lot about what's going on in the government. And so he's a powerful person who merits transparency just like any other powerful people do.
Glenn, thanks for your time.
Great to be with you. Nice talking to you.
We have published proof that the election campaign of Bernie Sanders was sabotaged in a corrupt manner by Debbie Wasserman Schultz and others within the DNC.
Serving the public interest or the machinations of a foreign power? Wikileaks and its founder have come under growing scrutiny, accused by the Clinton campaign and the White House of doing Russia's bidding by trying to influence the election.
Putin and the Russian government are directing the attacks, the hacking on American accounts,
leading journalists to question Assange's motives and those of his sources.
Mr. Assange, would you be able to say categorically that a foreign government did not hand you this material?
We don't give any material away as to who our sources are.
Be it a disgruntled employee or hackers working for a foreign government, journalists know when they get secret documents, the leaker has a motive, raising the question, does the motive matter? Richard Esposito, you're the recently departed head of investigations at NBC News. You've worked variously for the networks and newspapers as an investigative journalist. In your experience, you know there's a motive behind the person who would be giving you leaked documents. Does it matter?
I think in political coverage, what we're seeing today, it matters more. There's always a motive, as you said, and motive matters. But it's one thing to get documents from, let's say, a disgruntled civil service employee, or to get documents from a Snowden. But when you get documents in the middle of a heated election campaign, you have to ask yourself why. We in the mainstream media sometimes take things on deadline too quickly as true when there is a motive and you haven't yet explored it.
Well, and to that very question, I mean, even if one news outlet publishes and says, we've looked at this, in our estimation, it's fair to run with this, are you convinced that other media outlets are doing that same due diligence, or are they just going, well, they cleared it, so we're going to go with it?
You know, there's such a rush for all of the media to get something out that very often you see, according to the Times, the Toronto Star, this material is accurate, but you haven't yet seen your own due diligence. And I always become uncomfortable, depending on the outlet, you know, more or less so, with just putting it out there without checking yourself. It causes more trouble than it's worth, and it's repeatedly caused that problem for news organizations, where you discover that the one outlet that said it was vetted, said it was fair, said they had 3 sources, you later discover the material was one source from 3 different people. And
we've seen that very
thing
enough happen in this campaign, where people have assumed that something that was out there had been vetted, was found to be legitimate. Let's listen very quickly to an example of Fox News getting caught on that.
In what appears to be a reference to Bernie Sanders supporters, although all that's absolutely clear is it's people on the left, calling them bucket of losers, she refers to.
Okay, so that turned out to be a hoax, and they had to walk back on that. But when you've got these masses of materials coming at you, these data dumps, and the clock ticking because the campaign is underway, how do you verify if what you've got is real?
You try your best to get your sources to give you everything they can, with caveats, concerns, their past experience, everything they can about the sender and the document. And then you try to go in the front door to the agencies whose documents they are or purport to be and see how much they'll give you. Unlike the Snowden documents, where people like me had them for months and had weeks of time with each of the agencies, you're rushing against the clock, which is hardly the ideal way to look at material like that.
Richard, thanks for your insight on this.
You're welcome, Diana.
Especially from the dishonest media, that's for sure.
It's becoming a dangerous part of this campaign, the very act of covering it. The problem with the blame game. My POV later. Plus,
there's recommendations, there's answers. They don't seem to be enforced.
a CBC News investigation. Why are some Canadian prisons using solitary confinement so much more often than others? But first, investigative journalists and whistleblowers aren't the only ones ruffling feathers in this election campaign.
This man is clearly unfit to be commander-in-chief.
Wrong.
He is a bully.
Shut up.
He started the birther movement.
You did.
He says climate change is a hoax invented by China.
It's pronounced China.
Saturday Night Live doing what it does best, with actors Alec Baldwin and Kate McKinnon skewering both presidential candidates. But the show has managed to not only get into Donald Trump's skin, but under it as well.
Donald called it a hit job on me. Time to retire the boring and unfunny show. Alec Baldwin portrayal stinks.
Trump says the skits are an example of the media rigging the election. In fact, he's merely the latest in a long list of politicians who've been fodder for comedians on both sides of the border.
And next things, you would be running a wonderful, well-organized campaign.
The next president of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
The media really ticks me off.
Trump may yet come around to embracing his caricature. Either way, comedians are giving people one more reason to look forward to Saturday night.
On Election Day, mark your calendars, write it down. Here's the date. It's November 35th.
Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. Ontario says it wants to outlaw automated computer programs that snatch up concert and sports tickets. The announcement comes after a CBC Marketplace investigation. A student journalist faces a backlash after exposing shocking behavior at a University of Ottawa pub crawl. CBC News learns that military vehicles being sold to Saudi Arabia will be tested on a Canadian base. The sale has been slammed by activists because of the kingdom's human rights record. A Go Public report finds pharmacies don't have to report medication dispensing errors to a formal public body. An 8-year-old boy died after being given the wrong medication. And a CBC News investigation into the use of solitary confinement finds that some Canadian prisons are using the practice far more than the national norm. That investigation began with a simple question: how often is the practice of completely segregating a prisoner being used in Canada? The answer to that question wouldn't be found in a data dump. CBC journalists had to go looking for it. CBC News gathered and analyzed multi-year data from every prison in the country, looking at how many people were put in solitary confinement, for how long, and how prisons stacked up against each other. They found the use of segregation has been trending down.
What we've seen is focused attention on reducing segregation.
But some prisons, mainly in Quebec, BC, and New Brunswick, buck the national trend. Good stories, though, go beyond the numbers to the people affected.
Every time people look at segregation, they are horrified in this country. They should continue to be horrified.
If it happened to us, it can happen to anybody.
We can't bring Ashley back, but I am really more than concerned about the people who are still suffering.
Families who've learned through tragedy the toll that segregation can take. Cease Rosner, you're the managing editor for CBC News in Manitoba, and you oversee the work of the investigators there. Talk to us about what you see as the main takeaway out of the information that you collected.
Well, Diana, we all know solitary confinement has been in the news quite a bit recently, and we also know that it's trending down. There's been a lot of criticism of it. What was very interesting and what we discovered is that there's huge variability in this process across the country. And as your report mentioned, some prisons are using it at a far higher rate than others. Sometimes, if you compare maximum to maximum security institutions, some are using it 3 times as much as some others. When you compare medium to medium institutions, you get factors of 7 and 8 times as much. So what our data was able to show is that there's a lot of local control amongst individual wardens, and critics have really taken issue with that in a process where there seems to be a lot of political will to reduce the amount of segregation. It is still quite high, and the duration of it is still quite high.
In this program, we've been talking about data dumps, data journalism. It's kind of a phrase that journalists are getting used to, that I think the public is just sort of starting to hear in a frequent way. And we've been talking about it from the perspective of millions of documents dumped on journalists who now try to figure out what's in there as a story. Let's talk about what you did, which is really the reverse process.
You're right, we set about to gather this data. Some of it was easier to do than others. We made some media requests to gather some of the data. We had to go by way of the Access to Information Act to gather other parts of it. And then the work was done to analyze that data, to really see what does it mean, how can we parse this, and what conclusions can we draw. And sometimes that's served up in an annual report or in a report from an institute. In this case, and in a lot of cases, journalists are now doing that analysis themselves, and we drew our own original conclusions that hadn't been done before about the actual rate and usage of this tool in individual institutions across the country.
And so as journalists, you're gathering this data, you're investigating, you're looking for the stories inside, but it's so important to remember that it's all about people, that's what the data represents. What was the human story in this for you?
You know, a lot of people have talked about solitary confinement. We talked to quite a few of the people that have gone through it to themselves, people that have been in solitary for over a year. The UN has come out against this. Different levels of government have said they want to reduce the incidence of solitary confinement. And when you talk to the people that have gone through it and experienced it, you realize that there's a huge human cost involved.
And the Ontario government is already saying it's going to take a look at restricting the use of segregation. So this work is having impact. Good to talk to you, Cease.
Thanks, Diana.
This is as close as many of us will ever come to solitary confinement.
You are going to undergo many different kinds of reactions.
A virtual reality project from the Guardian newspaper in the UK, part of its extensive reporting on the US prison system. It includes the sights and sounds of a small, windowless cell and mimics some of the symptoms prisoners can experience. It's really something. If you want to check it out, I've tweeted a link at Swain Diana.
Well, this election is being rigged by the national media.
Everyone's blaming the messenger in the U.S. election, and it's taking a dark turn. That's ahead.
And who likes CNN?
Plus, your chance to ask me anything about investigative journalism. First, investigators on assignment. Here's Connie Walker.
I'm an investigative reporter at CBC News in Toronto. You hear of journalists getting tips from whistleblowers or anonymous sources, brown paper envelopes filled with secret documents. But the tip that sparked this story just showed up in my email one day. The subject said, Alberta Williams murder. I clicked it open and I still get chills when I think about what it said. She was murdered by, and then it named a person. I didn't recognize the sender of the email, but I wrote back right away. And the identity of the person named in that email is just as shocking as the identity of the person who wrote it. And that was really the beginning of a months-long investigation into this unsolved murder of a young Indigenous woman. We'll bring you that story over the next 8 weeks in our podcast and web series called Missing and Murdered: Who Killed Alberta Williams?
Got a story tip for the investigators? Share it anonymously at securedrop.cbc.ca. You can also contact us through email, that's investigators@cbc.ca, or just drop me a line on Twitter at Swain Diana. You're watching The Investigators on CBC News Network. What we want to do with this show is bring you deeper into the journalism that we're doing, the work that we're doing, from the first idea for a story to the final report. So we've come up with this segment called Ask Me Anything about investigative journalism, and I'll try to answer. And Nkosi has a question. So what would you like to know?
Sure. So my question to you is, how would you handle a subject that was evading your questions without being so insistent to the point where they become uncooperative?
It's interesting because sometimes you get people who will agree to do the interview and then evade the question while you're sitting in front of them. I think you, as a journalist, you press. You're there to get an answer. You're there to get some kind of response. But at the same time, it's always been my personal view that there's no point in arguing with someone who's not going to say something. What you can do, though, is show that moment. And the audience can make up its own mind about why the answer didn't come out. So you can press to a point, but sometimes the person not answering speaks volumes.
Okay.
Does
Understood.
that answer it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
The election is being rigged by corrupt media, especially from the dishonest media, that's for sure. I think the media is trying to discourage our people from getting out.
It's a time-honored tradition for politicians in his country and ours.
This election is being rigged by the national media.
The media is 100% behind Hillary.
I think it's the media that's going to come out on the short end of this stick.
What is new is how far Trump seems prepared to go with that line. Google Trends shows the phrase corrupt media skyrocketing in just the past few weeks. At his rallies with the media in a penned-in area, he gets the audience fired up, telling them the media is rigging the election, essentially robbing them of their vote. Now just imagine yourself as a reporter in that room. The right to fair and free elections is fundamental to any democracy. So is the right to a free press and the right to feel safe doing your job. It's hard to see how someone isn't going to get hurt or worse with rhetoric this overheated, and it's hard to see how that could make America great again. I'm Diana Swain. This is The Investigators.